Well, welcome everybody to today's CSSGJ talk. My name is Oliver Dodd, a doctoral student in political economy at the University of Nottingham. I am very pleased and to welcome and introduce today's speaker, John Holmwood. John Holmwood is Professor Emeritus in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Nottingham and Senior Researcher in the Centre for Science, Technology and Society Studies of the Institute for Philosophy at the Czech Academy of Science. He is co-founder and joint managing director of Discovery Society, a free online monthly magazine of social research, criticism, and policy analysis. He was co-founder of the Campaign for the Public University between 2010 and 2017, and he was also president of the British Sociological Association 2012 to 2014. John researches sociological theory, social inequality, higher education, and religion and schooling. He has particular interests in public sociology, including the public university and the colonial construction of sociologies and publics. He was an expert witness for the defense in professional misconduct cases brought against teachers accused of a plot to Islamicize schools in Birmingham, the Trojan Horse Affair. In relation to the UK government's so-called counter-extremism prevent strategy, John, alongside Teresa O'Toole, authored the book Countering Extremism in British Schools, The Truth About the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair, published by Policy Press in 2018. John has published extensively in peer-reviewed academic articles and journalistic pieces. Some of his works include, but are far from limited to, Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, published in 2021 by Polity Press, a Manifesto for the Public University, published by Bloomsbury in 2011. Today's CSSGJ talk is titled Preventing Participation, How the UK Government's Counter-Extremism Strategy Undermines Civil Society and Democratic Freedoms. John, you have approximately 40 minutes for your talk, and we'll follow this with a similar amount of time for the Q&A. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak, and it's very nice to be back in Nottingham, even if only virtually. I'm going to share some my screen, because I've got some PowerPoint slides which just make some of the things easier to get across. So just get this. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the government's counter-extremism strategy prevent, and particularly in the context of the recent independent review under William Shawcross. This reported in February of this year, and that was exactly 4 years after the review was first proposed. Although, as people may be aware, it was heavily leaked over the 6 months prior to publication, particularly to right-wing media sympathetic to the government. The report contains 34 recommendations, all of which have been accepted by the government, and unusually for a so-called independent report, the government didn't need much time to decide it was going to implement all of them and announce that simultaneously with the publication of the report. That has meant that the report itself has been subjected to very little scrutiny, and particularly as well in the context of the long period of leaking of what was going to be in it. I've been involved in something called the People's Review of Prevent, which was an alternative review of the Prevent strategy. And I'll say a bit more about what was involved in that. But essentially, there were quite a number of vicissitudes to the government's own independent review. It was set up initially with Lord Carlisle proposed as the reviewer, he was challenged by a number of civil society organizations and finally stood down. The government's response was to appoint somebody with even less credentials than Lord Carlisle. I think Lord Carlisle certainly had credentials and the intellectual qualities necessary for the review, but the perceived disadvantage of Lord Carlisle was his earlier very strong commitment to the idea of prevent. William Shawcross himself was well known as active within the Henry Jackson Society, also with Policy Exchange, and had been charity commissioner, and during his period as a charity commissioner had very specifically targeted Muslim organizations. And one of the consequences then of the government nominating him was that there was a boycott announced, and that boycott was by Muslim-led civil society organizations, but also other civil liberties groups like Amnesty, Open Society, Runnymede, Liberty, and so on. And the difficulty we perceived at the People's Review of Prevent was that meant, well, we didn't think that William Shawcross would do a very objective job, wouldn't consider the criticisms that had been made of Prevent, and nor would he reflect the experiences of those who had been directly impacted by Prevent. Mainly, he interviewed and carried out roundtables with Prevent practitioners. So what we thought, well, the downside of a boycott, you make that point, but the downside of the boycott is that you don't then get your view across. So what we proposed was to do our own review of Prevent, which in fact we published in last February, because we thought that the Shawcross review was imminent. So we have a long report published in February 22. Then William Shawcross's independent review came out February of this year. And because it was a year since we'd published our People's Review, we decided that we'd use the material for the People's Review to subject the Shawcross report to detailed and systematic criticism. So that's essentially what I'm talking about today can all be found within these documents, and particularly in our response to the Shawcross review. But first, let me begin with some background about Prevent itself, so people are familiar with what we're considering. It was first set up in 2003 as part of the contest counter-terrorism approach. And that had 4 strands, one called Protect, about protective arrangements against the threat of a terrorist attack. And people may be aware there's new legislation associated with that following the Manchester Arena bombing, so-called Martin's Law, which has come in. Prepare, which is about the mitigation of the impact of a terrorist attack. Pursue, directed at stopping terrorist attacks. That's effectively the counter-terrorism police and other security services. And then the final strand of it, which is Prevent, which is the segment that I'm going to look at today, which has the purpose of stopping people becoming terrorists or from supporting terrorism. That's the description of it. Now, the UK now has the most extensive legislation in Europe covering both violent and non-violent terrorism. And there's been a proliferation of legislation on counter-terrorism, particularly since 2015. And this includes a proliferation of counter-extremism measures associated with PREVENT, designed to tackle what are called the ideas and behaviors which are claimed as possible precursors to terrorist actions. Now, it's absolutely vital to understand that the ideas and behaviors, which are the focus of PREVENT, are themselves lawful. So the PREVENT is a scheme designed at mitigating what are otherwise understood to be lawful ideas and behaviors. And PREVENT began in 2003 with a focus on the promotion of community cohesion, but it has become increasingly concerned with issues of security. And that's one of the tensions within PREVENT. It's going to be the security aspect of PREVENT that I'm going to be engaged with. But there is also another dimension, which is that of community cohesion, projects designed to supposedly bring communities together. Now, Clive Walker, commenting about PREVENT in 2018, suggested that what's happened since 2003 is something that he's called a policy spiral. That is a situation in which the initial purposes and direction of PREVENT have been transformed through the process of adding to them. And he suggests a policy spiral, quote here, is susceptible to unresolved contradictions or gaps, dramatic direction changes, and uncertain outcomes. And there are a number of consequences that follow from this. One, of course, is a lack of comprehension of PREVENT in all its aspects amongst its practitioners, as well as Walker suggests the generation of what he calls inexact and contested meanings, objectives, and mechanisms, and they generate the dynamics of suspicion as much as persuasion. And so PREVENT has been generating this climate of criticism throughout its inception from 2003 onwards. And as PREVENT has been added to and as new aspects of it have been put in, then that has accumulated, that suspicion and criticism has accumulated. And yet the government, until the independent review was announced in 2019, had steadfastly refused to undertake a proper review of PREVENT. It's been subject to just one internal Home Office review in 2011, and it was that review in 2011 which Lord Carlisle endorsed, which promoted the shift from community cohesion to security. But its proposals were not implemented until the Community Terrorism and Security Act of 2015. So we're looking at something that has been developing over time, has not had any reviews, and has actually had proposed changes of direction which have not been enacted until several years later. And in fact, if people are interested in the Birmingham Trojan Horse affair, it arises in that gap between 2011 and 2015. The teachers and governors are subjected to criticism in the light of the intentions of what the report in 2011 was proposing, but it wasn't until 2015, a year after the Trojan Horse affair, that the measures under which they were prosecuted, if you like, were brought into being. And that was something that brought about my interest and commitment and involvement in the area. The other thing about PREVENT is it's not subject to any kind of regular statutory review, as is required of the legislation on terrorism of which it is otherwise a part. So those 4 strands, 3 of them come under the remit of the independent reviewer of terrorism, but PREVENT is specifically excluded from that remit, despite all independent reviewers saying that it should either be included under their remit or there should be a statutory provision for review. And that's something that even Lord Carlisle has argued. And what an independent statutory review does, as in the case of the review of terrorism legislation, is it requires annual reports and also allows for the possibility of initiating investigations. None of that has happened, and that's of course contributes to the suspicion around PREVENT that Professor Clive Walker identified. But the government and its allied think tanks, and I use that very specifically, like Policy Exchange, the Henry Jackson Society, but one can also include the Legatum Institute and so on, a whole series of them, regularly attack those who criticize PREVENT as campaigners against PREVENT, so focusing on their criticisms of PREVENT rather than the substance of what the criticism, or the fact that they criticize PREVENT rather than the substance of what the criticism is actually about, and describes them, as Policy Exchange did in a report called Delegitimizing Counter-Terrorism, suggests that by their criticism, they are facilitators of terrorism. And that was a chorus that accompanied the leaks of the Shawcross review over the 6 months prior to its publication. Critics, especially Muslim critics, find themselves denounced as extremists just by virtue of criticizing government policy. And to give you an indication of how serious that criticism was, it included the claim made in the Shawcross report that the failure to stop the Manchester Arena bomber Salman Abedi could be attributed to a campaign against PREVENT led by MEND at Salford University, where Abedi attended as a student. Now, the Manchester Arena inquiry, their final report, was published shortly after Shawcross, and it stated categorically that Abedi could not have been stopped through a PREVENT referral. And the Manchester Arena inquiry report also laid responsibility at the security services operating under the Pursue part of the contest strategy. So what you have is a conflation of different aspects of the overall contest strategy. Pursue is widely described as successful, except when it fails. And I'm not criticizing them for failures. I mean, policies do and strategies do fail. But as soon as there was something that could be identified as a terrorist attack that was not stopped, the blame immediately shifted to PREVENT. And that's a feature of the Shawcross report generally, a feature of the media reporting, and it was something that was very heavily pushed out into the press before Shawcross submitted his report. So what I'm going to do is talk mainly about the specific substantive harms that are associated with the PREVENT duty that was introduced in 2015, because that's the part of PREVENT that will be most familiar to people now. I'm not denying the harms associated with earlier iterations of PREVENT, merely suggesting that the harms have accumulated. But the early form of prevent, identified with community cohesion, was associated with the stigmatization and misrepresentation of British Muslim communities. For example, representing them as self-segregated, despite the fact that all the sociological evidence suggests that Muslim communities in Britain show the highest level of commitment to what is presented as the British values from which they apparently segregate themselves. So there are really serious issues running through, but the prevent duty itself represented a step change in prevent. And most people here, I'm sure, will know that the prevent duty applies to education settings from nurseries, primary and secondary schools, onto colleges and universities. It applies in health settings, in the NHS, not in general practice, and across youth services. It also applies in prisons and probation services, although measures there had been in place before 2015. And that's why it's important to understand how prevent is an accretion of measures, and its initial origin in the criminal justice system is important, but the major application of prevent is now outside the criminal justice system. According to the Home Office, over 1 million individuals responsible for the provision of public services had by 2019 been trained to spot the supposed signs of possible extremism. And of course, and data hasn't been released on how many people have been trained since then. Now, the process of prevent, if people are not so familiar with it, involves an initial flagging of concern, at which point counter-terrorism officers are likely to be involved in initial interviews with the individual. Go on to say who gets drawn into that, but that individual can be a school pupil, it can be somebody in a health setting, and so on. And their first contact is somebody will have made a report on them, and there'll be an initial interview. The decision at that point is made either not to proceed or to proceed with a referral to a local multi-agency prevent panel. Again, that includes counter-terrorism officers. And it's only referrals, that is, once you've gone past the initial stage and have gone to a prevent referral to a prevent panel, that public data on prevent is gathered. So once you're at a prevent panel, then you're assessed for your adoption onto what's called a channel de-radicalization proportion. Now, the proportion of those who are referred, who go on to a channel program, varies from year to year, but is in the region of 7 to 13% of all referrals, which is, of course, a subset of all the people interviewed by counter-terrorism officers and others about their possible extremism. Now, it's significant that nowhere in the 2015 Act that sets out the prevent duty is extremism defined. And in all cases, or in any case, all behaviors and ideas that are associated with extremism under prevent are within the law. And I want to stress that point because the first step, when somebody is identified under prevent, that is when the first counter-terrorism officer begins the process of interviewing, is to check if any offences are committed and if the individual is otherwise flagged for offences. And there are a few occasions where they have committed offences. I mean, a handful of occasions out of all those involvements. But PREVENT is otherwise not part of the criminal justice system, except for those who are already in prison and coming out onto probation where PREVENT functions for them. But for the majority of people involved with PREVENT, they have no connection with the criminal justice system. And just to give you an indication of the distance that PREVENT is from the commission of any offence, is say the police do have the powers to consider individuals and offending from the perspective of what's called inchoate offences. That is, offences relating to criminal acts that have not or have not yet been committed. So intentionally encouraging or assisting an offence, encouraging or assisting an offence believing it will be committed, and encouraging or assisting offence believing one or more will be committed. These are inchoate offences. They're subject to the law. Nobody dealt with under PREVENT is close to the commission of even an inchoate offence. So PREVENT operates within what's called the pre-crime space. And what Professor Kodogirti from LSE described in, writing a foreword to our first People's Review of PREVENT, he described that space as the space we used to call freedom. People are going about their lawful business, expressing lawful opinions. Now, one of the paradoxes of PREVENT is that because it operates outside the criminal justice system, there are few formal protections for those who are caught up in it. For example, with regard to police interventions and counter-terrorist police interviewing an individual in association with being reported for PREVENT, a child can be interviewed without the presence of their parents or a responsible adult. And in addition, any information gathered on an individual can be kept and shared amongst agency, including the information gathered at the point where somebody is initially interviewed and where there's a decision not to proceed with a referral. So it's a massive data gathering exercise. And because the data that is gathered is in principle associated with a commission of a terrorist offence, that's the category under which the individual is being interviewed, a possible future terrorism offence, the data can be kept for 100 years. There are requirements to review every 7 years, but no requirement, even if there's been no other indication within 7 years, the police can continue to recommend that the information continues to be held. Now, Shawcross, to his credit, it's not a very big credit, has said that there should be a review after 3 years. But of course, the review after 3 years doesn't mean the data is deleted. It means the police just have to say whether they wish to carry on holding it or not. And at present, that situation is 7 years. Now, notice that it's crucial for understanding current media debates about PREVENT, and the framing offered by Shawcross is that PREVENT should be moved away to thinking about safeguarding vulnerable individuals towards securing public safety. So while it's gone too far in thinking about the vulnerabilities of individuals, what we should think about is the vulnerability of the public. But given the very considerable distance from the commission of any offence, any intervention under prevent can only be justified in terms of the protection of an individual because they may be vulnerable to a harm where that harm is defined as the harm of being radicalized. Now, we don't disagree with Shawcross's view that prevent has become too mixed up with safeguarding. Indeed, we want to draw a different conclusion about it and believe that the problem with the association of prevent and safeguarding is that it delegitimizes safeguarding otherwise and actions that truly might or should be taken in the interests of a child. So we think it would be in the interests of the children not to be safeguarded under prevent. So let's look a little further. So all children in England are subject to scrutiny under the prevent duty from the moment they start secondary school, and indeed in some nursery school, and indeed in some pre-nursery settings. So all childcare in the pre-nursery setting and nurseries are subject to the prevent duty, scrutinising children through school until they leave secondary school, and it continues in higher education. That's an extraordinary securitization of children in the name of safeguarding. In 2021-22, the education sector provided over a third of all referrals, 36% of referrals. And the referrals in the education sector are younger than from any other sector. The median age of a referral is 14, meaning that half of all referrals, and here the figures are 1,152 children in 21-22 were under 14. And that means that 5 children for each school day in England are being subject to a prevent referral. Now, if Shawcross was serious about the need to emphasize public safety, he would recommend removing the prevent duty from schooling. That's our opinion, because there is no real, what risk does a primary school child represent from the point of view of terrorism, or a secondary school child? We can come back in the discussion, if you like, to whether there are the handful of terrorism cases that are committed by children of later school age. Many of those are a consequence of the introduction of new terrorist offences, which give rise to inadvertent criminalisation of children, downloading material from the internet, for example. And that's the view that the independent reviewer of terrorism has recently published, stating that there are too much of an application of terrorist legislation to young people. So I think the argument, if one took safeguarding seriously, would be to prevent the securitization of children. But Shawcross also complains that too many of those referred to prevent, instead of going on to channel, are recommended to mental health services. And that indicates, in his view, that they've been misidentified as an extremism risk, where really they're having mental health problems. But as Charlotte Heath Kelly shows in her contribution to our response to Shawcross, in fact, the healthcare sector receives more referrals from prevent than it makes to prevent. And this is a further indication that the prevent duty, at least as it applies to schooling and in health is unwarranted. So what are we to make of the other main argument of Shawcross, that Prevent has lost its proper focus on Islamist extremism and is too much directed towards right-wing experience? And he argues that Islamist extremism is much the more serious risk, and that's where he makes the argument about the Manchester Arena bombing and other cases. And he argues that this occurs because those involved in Prevent don't want to be seen as racist. And in response, he recommends greater central control over Prevent and greater involvement of counter-terrorism police. So just look his statement. My research shows that the present boundaries around what is termed by Prevent as extremist Islamist ideology are drawn too narrowly, while the boundaries around the ideology of the extreme right wing are too broad. Well, the question is, does his research show that? I mean, he doesn't do much research, but the evidence he puts forward certainly don't show it. And the reason is because the data it's easy to demonstrate this because the data that he has is the data available on referrals. And in 21-22, 13% of all referrals were adopted onto channel. Of those, 42% were for far-right extremism, 19% were for Islamist extremism. So what that means is those making the judgment, and as I've stressed, there are two stages at which counter-terrorism police are making a judgment about a risk. The first is referring them to a Prevent panel. The second is referring them from a Prevent panel to channel. And the highest number of referrals are for far-right extremism, but that occurs where the proportion of all referrals was similar for both categories. That is, a higher proportion of right-wing referrals get regarded as a serious risk by counter-terrorism officers than do those referred for Islamist extremism. From that, we can see the situation is the opposite of what he claims. The definition is drawn broadly for Islamist extremism and narrowly for right-wing extremism. Otherwise, the proportion going on to channel would be different. A greater focus on Islamist extremism would give rise to a greater number of Prevent referrals of Muslims, but a decline in the proportion of them going on to channel. For right-wing extremism, the opposite would occur. That is, there'd be fewer referrals, but a higher proportion of adoptions onto channel. So the report is incoherent in its core area. So let's go a little further in what Shawcross is proposing. So he's proposing that there should be a focus away from right-wing and onto Islamist extremism. And how is that going to be brought about? Well, I've been suggesting that the Prevent duty is authoritarian and also in breach of civil liberties insofar as the interventions are against people for whom their ideas and behaviours are lawful, and that it's also in breach of the rights of children, since they are a group most caught up in Prevent and representing the least risk within it. So, but is what Shawcross is recommending just a doubling down on existing features? And I think that there is something more fundamental going on. So what is proposed is a concentration of power in the Home Office through a new role provided to the Commission for Countering Extremism. it is going to be responsible for the direction of PREVENT across government departments, and also from the direction of PREVENT from the national to the local level. And that will include training and also the provision of definitions under which the PREVENT training is developed. PREVENT priority areas are abolished, and instead, PREVENT panels are being removed from local autonomy and becoming the responsibility of regional commissioners under the direct authority of the Home Office and under the direct political direction of the new commissioner. Now, if one goes back to the 2011 PREVENT strategy and then the 2015 Act, I've already referred to the fact that there's no definition of extremism within the legislation under which the PREVENT duty was introduced. And Shawcross uses a revealing phrase when he describes this, and he says that what happens is that PREVENT is missing a legislative backbone. And what that legislative backbone would be is a definition in law of extremism. But Shawcross is not providing a definition in law of extremism. What he's providing instead of a legislative backbone is a political backbone. That is a directorate within the Home Office responsible for determining the nature of PREVENT, how it is implemented, and so on. Now, there's also a recommendation in PREVENT that there should be no political engagement or public funding associated with Muslim-led civil society organizations if they are deemed to be extremist, and the determination of which is to be extremist is also handed to the new political directorate. Already mentioned that there are no statutory checks on how PREVENT operates, and Shawcross, and indeed there's no recommendation that there should be statutory oversight of PREVENT. Instead, all complaints are to be dealt with by this central political directorate within the Home Office. And the complaints are revealingly described as the complaints that will be dealt with are the ones called good faith complaints. This is in a report that has already described Muslim-led civil society organizations as bad faith actors. So I'll finish on the implications for higher education. There is now a new duty on universities to promote freedom of speech and academic freedom within the law. But as I've said, nothing covered under PREVENT is against the law. And so universities are now vulnerable to a challenge on their external speaker policies, and indeed with regard to any individual student or member of staff referred under the PREVENT duty. They can simply say, I have a lawful right to freedom of expression. The Office for Students have issued no guidelines on PREVENT, so we can assume that there must be guidelines coming. What might we expect? And what we might expect, I think, is rules on speakers associated with organizations that have failed the proposed new certification for Muslim-led civil society organizations. Let's be clear, this is a policy that is being promoted by Policy Exchange, and it's not promoted saying that all civil society organizations should be certified. The requirement is Muslim-led civil society organizations should have certification for whether or not they can be engaged with by any body in receipt of public funds. And I think we might expect the requirement to put compliance with PREVENT under student disciplinary codes, because at the moment, given that no law has been broken, then any student asked to attend a Prevent meeting can quite legitimately say, I'm free not to attend. There is no obligation on me to do so. So let's look at how Shawcross refers to the problem of civil liberties that is contained within Prevent. So he does have a shadow recognition. Of course, he has a major recognition of it in the sense that he's trying to get Prevent removed from its application to right-wing speech. But he has a statement that the campaign against Prevent has included some civil liberties groups and activists who seemingly, as a matter of principle, oppose a state-run scheme to counter specific ideas, attitudes, and non-criminal behaviors. So that's an extraordinary statement, that what is being advocated is a state-run scheme to counter specific ideas, attitudes, and non-criminal behaviors. And it's extraordinary to say that civil liberties groups take their attitude to it as a matter of principle. What sort of principle is civil liberties supposed to express? And then he says, no matter how light touch the scheme's methods. And of course, the demonstration, what we sought to do in the People's Review of Prevent was to show that Prevent is very far from light touch. And if one had the interests and welfare of our children at the forefront of our concerns, we would be seeking to safeguard them from Prevent, not subject them to the kind of safeguarding and securitized attention that Prevent represents. And of course, people are aware of general issues of policing within schools. It's ethnic minority children and religious minority children that are subject to those forms of policing. So I'll just conclude now with saying it's a commonplace to refer to terrorism as a form of political communication. But perhaps we should also see counter-terrorism as a form of political communication too. They would like us to see it in that way, and how they would like us to see it is it's a form of communication that upholds democratic values. But what I'll suggest to you is what is being communicated by counter-terrorism and by Prevent are not liberal values, but those of an authoritarian national conservatism. And I'll remind you that the Home Secretary gave a prime ministerial or conservative leader pitch at the National Conservative Conference in London just a week or so ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. That was a really important talk. Much appreciated. We're going to open it to the floor now. If anyone would like to ask some questions, I'm going to turn the recording on.